The tray hit the floor before I even understood what was happening. I was sitting 3 seats away, and I still remember the sound. Metal against polished tile, sharp and loud, cutting through the noise of the dining hall like a slap. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. And in the middle of that sudden silence stood Julian Ashford, grinning like he had just won something, and Mara Voss, sitting perfectly still, looking down at the mess of food now spread across the floor in front of her. She did not move. She did not even blink. My name is Leo Bennett, and I go to Solmir Academy, a school built into a ring station that orbits a quiet blue planet on the edge of civilized space. Solmir takes students from a dozen worlds and a dozen species, all of us thrown together to learn side by side, to prove that the galaxy can share one roof without tearing itself apart. Most days, it works. Most days, nobody thinks twice about who sits where, who speaks which language, who has 3 eyes or 2 hearts, or skin like cut glass. But some days, someone forgets the rules. Julian was Vantari, one of the older species in this part of the galaxy, tall and pale and quick, with reflexes fast enough to catch a falling glass before it touched the ground. His people were proud of that speed, proud of their bloodlines, proud most of all of being untouchable. Vantari skin bruised if you looked at it wrong, but nobody ever looked at it wrong, because nobody was fast enough to land a hand on a Vantari before he moved out of the way. Mara was human, and not just human, she was from Earth, but not the calm, protected inner cities most of us had heard about in history lessons. She was from one of the Deathworld regions, the wild belts where nature had never been tamed, where every plant could poison you, and every animal could end you, and the weather itself seemed to be trying to kill you before breakfast. Nobody at Solmir really understood what that meant. We had grown up on stations and gentle worlds, places built for comfort. To us, Deathworld was just a word in a textbook, a strange footnote about a distant, stubborn species that had somehow survived on a planet that should have wiped them out generations ago. Mara had arrived 3 weeks earlier, transferred in the middle of the term with no explanation and no fuss. She kept to herself. She ate alone at the same table every day, in the same chair, facing the door. She spoke only when a teacher asked her a direct question, and even then her answers were short, calm, and precise. She never laughed at anyone's jokes. She never joined anyone's group. She simply existed, quiet and still, like a held breath. At first, people were curious. Then people got bored of being curious, because she gave them nothing to feed on. No embarrassment, no fear, no reaction at all. And that, more than anything else, was what made Julian decide she was worth bothering. "It's an accident," he said, not sounding sorry at all, stepping over the spilled food like it was beneath him to even acknowledge it. "You should watch where you put your tray, Deathworld girl." A few of his friends laughed, not because it was funny, but because Julian expected them to. Mara looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were pale gray, calm in a way that made the back of my neck feel cold, though I could not have told you why at the time. She did not raise her voice. She did not even seem angry. "I'll clean it up," she said, and reached for a napkin. That should have been the end of it. Most people would have taken the win and walked away. But Julian was not most people. And worse, he had an audience now. Students from 3 different tables watching to see what would happen next. He crouched slightly, putting his face closer to hers, close enough that I could see her jaw tighten just a little, just barely. "You know," he said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, "I read about your planet. Survival of the fittest, right? Every creature clawing over every other creature just to see another sunrise. No wonder you people are so quiet. Guess growing up surrounded by animals does that to a person." More laughter, louder this time. Someone at the next table repeated the word animals, like it was the funniest thing they had heard all week. I felt my stomach twist, the way it does when you watch something wrong happening and you are not brave enough to do anything about it. I looked around the hall. teachers were supposed to patrol during lunch, but the dining hall was enormous, built to seat 400 students, and the two supervisors on duty were on the far side, dealing with a spilled drink and a small dispute over a card game. Nobody in charge had noticed yet. Nobody was coming to stop this. Mara set down the napkin she had picked up. She folded her hands together on the table, resting them there without tension, without a single visible sign that anything Julian said had landed anywhere close to a nerve. "Is that all?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. I saw it in the small flicker across his face, the tiny stumble before his confidence caught up with him again. He straightened, trying to recover the upper hand. "That's all?" he repeated, mocking her tone. "I insult your entire species, and that's the best you've got?" No wonder Deathworlders never built anything worth talking about. Too busy running from bugs the size of your head, probably. I want to be honest about something. Part of me, in that moment, expected Mara to snap back with something clever, something sharp enough to make the crowd laugh at him instead of her. That is how these things usually went at Solmere. Words for words. Whoever landed the better line walked away the winner, and everyone forgot about it by the next class period. But Mara did not do that. She simply watched him, not glaring, not glowering. Just watching, the way you might watch weather rolling in over a hill, calculating whether it was worth reaching for an umbrella yet. It was Priya Okonkwo, sitting across from me, who leaned over and whispered the thing I could not stop thinking about for the rest of the day. "She's not scared," Priya said quietly. "Look at her hands, they're not even shaking." I looked. Priya was right. Most people, when they are humiliated in front of a crowd, show something. Their hands tremble, or their face goes red, or their eyes water even when they try to stop it. Mara showed none of that. Her hands rested on the table, completely steady, fingers loose, like a musician waiting for a cue that had not come yet. Julian, either not noticing or not caring, decided the silence meant he had won. He straightened up fully, turned to his friends with a wide, satisfied grin, and raised his voice so the whole hall could hear him one more time. "See? Deathworlders don't even have the nerve to defend themselves. All that talk about surviving the wild, and she can't even survive lunch." The laughter that followed was the loudest yet. I did not laugh. Neither did Priya. Neither, I noticed, did our biology teacher, Professor Whitlock, who had just walked into the hall in time to catch the tail end of the comment. He frowned, opened his mouth as though he might intervene, then seemed to think better of it, perhaps assuming the moment had already passed. It had not passed. Not really. It had only paused. Mara reached down, picked up her tray from the floor with quiet, unhurried movements, and set the fallen food onto it, piece by piece, as if she were alone, in an empty room, instead of the center of attention for half the dining hall. When she finished, she stood, walked to the disposal chute at the side of the room, emptied the tray, and returned to her seat without a single word of protest, without a single glance back at Julian, who was still basking in the laughter of his friends like a man who had just won an argument that, as far as I could tell, nobody else had actually agreed with him on. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was over, that Mara had simply decided it was not worth the trouble, that she would rather absorb the insult quietly than give Julian the satisfaction of a reaction. I even felt a little sorry for her, in the way you feel sorry for someone who seems to have accepted defeat too easily. Looking back now, I understand how wrong I was. Professor Whitlock's class was the last period of the day, and it happened to be the one class Julian, Mara, and I all shared. It was an introductory course on comparative planetary biology, meant to teach us about the different environments our classmates had come from, though most students treated it as an easy elective, a chance to relax before the end of the school day. That afternoon, the lesson happened to be about extreme environments. Professor Whitlock, a tall, patient man with silver hair and a habit of pacing while he spoke, pulled up a series of images on the main screen at the front of the room. Barren deserts, crushing ocean trenches, frozen wastelands, and then, almost as an afterthought, a set of images labeled simply as Class 5 environments, Restricted Advisory. These are the rarest classifications in the Galactic Registry, Professor Whitlock explained, tapping through the images. Planets where the environment itself is actively hostile to complex life, gravity levels that strain the skeleton, atmospheric toxins, predator populations that evolved specifically to compete with intelligent species rather than avoid them. Most civilizations that arise on Class 5 worlds do not survive long enough to reach space travel. Someone near the front raised a hand. Then how do any of them make it? Professor Whitlock's expression grew more serious. The ones that do survive, he said, develop certain adaptations. Reaction speed increases dramatically over generations. Pain tolerance rises. Threat assessment becomes almost instinctive, faster than conscious thought. It has to. On those worlds, hesitation is fatal. A person who pauses to think before reacting to danger does not get a second chance to learn from the mistake. I glanced sideways at Mara without meaning to. She was sitting near the window, taking notes in small, neat handwriting, her expression unreadable, giving no sign that any of this applied to her personally. Earth, Professor Whitlock continued, and I noticed several heads turned slightly toward Mara's direction, though nobody said anything out loud, is an unusual case. Certain regions of Earth were classified as borderline Class 5 environments for most of human history, prior to significant technological development. Predator density, disease exposure, and environmental volatility in those regions produced populations with reaction times and physical resilience well above the galactic average for their technological tier. Julian, sitting 2 rows ahead of me, let out a small, unimpressed laugh, not loud enough to draw the professor's direct attention, but loud enough for those of us nearby to hear it clearly. "Sounds like an excuse for being savage," he muttered to the student beside him. I do not know if Mara heard him. If she did, she gave no sign of it. She kept writing, calm and steady, her pen moving in smooth, unhurried strokes across the page. Professor Whitlock, unaware of the comment, moved on to close the lesson. "The important thing to remember," he said, looking around the room, "is that appearances can be deeply misleading. A species that seems quiet, or reserved, or slow to react in ordinary social situations may in fact possess response capabilities far beyond what casual observation would suggest. It is a mistake, historically a very costly one, to assume that calm behavior in a Deathworld-adapted individual reflects weakness rather than control." The bell rang before anyone could ask a follow-up question, and the room dissolved into the usual scramble of bags and books and shuffling feet. I watched Mara gather her things slowly, methodically, unhurried, even as everyone else rushed past her toward the door. Julian, of course, could not resist one final comment as he passed her desk on his way out. "Control," he said, drawing the word out mockingly, loud enough that half the room could hear him. "Is that what we're calling it now? I just call it knowing your place." A few people laughed, though quieter this time, more nervous than amused, as though even they were starting to sense something was different about this particular exchange, something that did not sit quite right, though none of us could have said exactly what. Mara looked up at him then, just for a moment. It was not anger in her eyes. It was not even irritation. It was something closer to patience, the kind of patience a person shows toward a small, noisy animal that has not yet learned it is standing somewhere dangerous. "You should be careful," she said quietly, "about deciding where my place is." It was not a threat. Her voice never rose. There was no edge of temper in it at all. And yet something about the stillness underneath those words made the back of my neck go cold all over again. The same feeling I had gotten in the dining hall earlier, a feeling I still could not quite name. Julian only smirked, clearly hearing nothing but weakness dressed up in calm words, and walked out of the room with his friends trailing behind him, already laughing about something else entirely, already moving on, already forgetting. I did not forget. I sat there for a moment after everyone else had gone, watching Mara zip her bag closed with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything else, and I found myself thinking about what Professor Whitlock had said only minutes before. A species that seems quiet may possess response capabilities far beyond what casual observation would suggest. I did not know it yet, not with any certainty, not with anything I could have explained to another person without sounding foolish. But some small, quiet part of me had already begun to understand that Julian Ashford was standing far closer to danger than he realized, and that the countdown, whatever it was counting down to, had already begun the moment that tray hit the floor. The next morning began with a rumor already spreading through the halls before I had even reached my locker. By the time I got to my first class, 3 different people had already asked me if it was true that Julian Ashford had a plan to embarrass Mara Voss in front of the entire school. I did not know the details yet, only that something had shifted overnight, that whatever had happened in the dining hall the day before had not settled things at all. It had only sharpened Julian's resolve. I found out the shape of his plan during our shared study period, when Julian's friend Damon Fairweather leaned across the table to brag about it to anyone who would listen. "He's not letting this go," Damon said, grinning like he had been let in on something exciting. "Julian says nobody makes him look small in front of people and gets away with it. He's got something planned for the assembly today." The assembly. Every student at Solmere Academy knew about the weekly assembly, held in the largest hall on the station, where all 400 students gathered together for announcements, presentations, and the occasional showcase of student achievement. It was the one place at school where everyone, from every grade, every species, every background, sat in the same room at the same time. It was, in other words, the perfect stage for someone who wanted the biggest possible audience for whatever he was planning. I tried to focus on my classes that morning, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange, cold feeling I had gotten the day before, the one I still could not fully explain. Mara Voss had not raised her voice. She had not clenched a fist or narrowed her eyes in anger, and yet something about the quiet, patient way she had told Julian to be careful about deciding her place had stayed with me all night, echoing in my thoughts long after I had gone to sleep. I saw Mara once during the morning, in the hallway between classes, and I almost worked up the nerve to say something to her, to warn her that Julian was planning something for the assembly. But she walked past with the same calm, unreadable expression she always wore, her pace steady, her eyes forward, and I lost my nerve before a single word left my mouth. What would I even have said? "Watch out, he's planning to embarrass you again?" She already knew that. Anyone with eyes could see that Julian was not finished with her. What none of us understood yet was that Mara was not the one who needed the warning. The assembly began at the usual time, in the usual way. Vice Principal Aldrich Thorne, a broad-shouldered man from a heavy-gravity world, stood at the podium and worked through the standard announcements, upcoming events, schedule changes, a reminder about proper conduct in shared spaces that suddenly felt more meaningful than it had the week before. I sat near the back with Priya, scanning the rows of students for Mara, and found her seated near the middle of the hall, alone as always, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Julian sat several rows ahead of her, close enough that he could turn around and be seen, close enough that whatever he planned to do would be visible to nearly the entire student body. I noticed he kept glancing toward the back corner of the stage, where a portable presentation screen had been set up for student project showcases, a routine part of nearly every assembly. When Vice Principal Thorne finished his announcements, he opened the floor for the week's showcase segment, a chance for students to present projects, achievements, or announcements of their own, provided they had signed up in advance. I had forgotten, until that exact moment, that students were allowed to request a slot on the schedule. Julian had requested one. He stood, straightened his jacket with a small, deliberate motion clearly meant to draw attention, and made his way to the front of the hall, amid a scattering of polite applause from his friends. He took the small handheld microphone from Vice Principal Thorne, offered the crowd a confident smile, and turned the presentation screen on behind him. "Thank you," he said smoothly. "I wanted to share something I put together for our comparative biology unit. I think everyone will find it pretty interesting. The screen behind him lit up with an image of a wild, overgrown landscape, all jagged rock and tangled vegetation, clearly meant to represent an untamed Deathworld environment. Beneath the image, in bold lettering, were the words, "Adaptation or Aggression, a Case Study." My stomach dropped. I glanced toward Mara. She had not moved. Her expression had not changed at all. If she understood what was about to happen, she gave no outward sign of it. Julian clicked through a series of slides, each one carefully chosen to paint a picture of Deathworld humans as little more than clever animals, dressed up in language that sounded almost scientific, but was clearly meant to mock rather than inform. He used words like primitive instinct and uncivilized aggression, pausing between each slide to let his tone carry the insult even when the words themselves stayed just barely within the bounds of what a teacher might allow. A few students laughed, uncertain at first, then more openly as Julian's confidence grew and his jokes became less subtle. I felt sick watching it happen, watching an entire room slowly decide it was acceptable to laugh along, simply because nobody wanted to be the first to say it was wrong. Vice Principal Thorne, standing near the podium, frowned deeply, clearly displeased, but the presentation had already been approved in advance, and stopping a student mid-showcase in front of the entire school was apparently a bigger step than he was willing to take without being certain the content justified it. Julian reached his final slide. It showed a simple photograph of Earth from orbit, half of it lit by daylight, half shadowed in darkness, with a caption beneath it that read, "Some places never really evolve past survival of the fittest." He lowered the microphone slightly, turned to look directly at Mara across the room, and delivered his closing line with the practiced confidence of someone who had clearly rehearsed it many times in front of a mirror. "I just think it's important," he said, "that we understand where some of our classmates really come from. No offense to anyone, some people just can't help what they were raised around." The room went quiet, in the specific way that happens when everyone senses something crossed a line, but nobody is certain enough to say so out loud. I looked toward Mara again. She had finally moved, just slightly, turning her head to look directly back at Julian, across the rows of seated students. Her expression had not changed. There was no anger in it, no humiliation, nothing that gave Julian the reaction he had clearly been hoping for. Instead, she simply said, in a voice that was calm, clear, and carried easily across the silent hall, "Are you finished?" It was not shouted. It did not need to be. The stillness of the room carried it perfectly to every corner. Julian blinked, caught off guard by how steady she sounded, then recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that came out thinner than he probably intended. "I think the point speaks for itself," he said. "Some of us build civilizations. Some of us just survive them." Vice Principal Thorne finally stepped forward, clearly deciding enough was enough. "Mr. Ashford," he said firmly, "that will be all. Please return to your seat." Julian handed back the microphone, still wearing his confident smile, clearly satisfied with himself, clearly believing he had won something in front of the entire school. He walked back to his seat, past the row where Mara sat, and as he passed her, he leaned down slightly, close enough that only those nearby could hear him, and added one final comment. "No hard feelings," he said, "just facts." Mara did not respond. She watched him walk past, her eyes tracking his movement with the same calm, careful attention she had shown the day before, and once again I found myself thinking of Professor Whitlock's lesson, of threat assessment becoming almost instinctive, faster than conscious thought, of a species that had learned, through painful necessity, exactly how much patience was worth spending on a threat that had not yet become serious enough to answer. The assembly continued after that, moving on to other students' presentations, other announcements, other pieces of ordinary school business. But the mood in the hall had shifted. I could feel it in the way people glanced toward Mara throughout the rest of the assembly, some with pity, some with the same uneasy curiosity Priya and I had felt the day before, a few, disturbingly, with the same amused satisfaction Julian clearly felt. When the assembly finally ended, and students began filing out of the hall, I caught up with Priya near the exit, both of us walking slower than the crowd around us, both of us thinking the same uncomfortable thoughts. "That was awful," Priya said quietly. "Why didn't Thorne stop him sooner?" "He didn't know what the slides were going to say," I said. "By the time he figured it out, it was already over." Priya shook her head. She didn't even react. How does someone just sit there and take that in front of everyone? I thought about the question for a long moment before answering, remembering the stillness in Mara's hands, the calm in her voice, the patient, measuring way she had looked at Julian both times he had chosen to humiliate her in public. "I don't think she's taking it," I said slowly. "I think she's just waiting." Priya frowned at me. Waiting for what? I did not have an answer for her, not then, but over the following classes that day, I found myself paying closer attention to the small details I had overlooked before. During our afternoon science lab, Mara moved through the room with an efficiency that seemed almost too precise, measuring chemical samples with steady hands, never hesitating, never second-guessing a single motion. During our short break between periods, I watched her cross the courtyard and noticed how her eyes moved constantly, scanning the space around her without ever seeming to focus on anything in particular, the way a person watches a room out of habit rather than necessity. It was during our final class of the day, a shared engineering workshop, that something small happened that I did not think much of at the time, but that I would remember clearly later, once everything else had unfolded. One of the workshop stations used a heavy magnetic clamp to hold metal panels steady while students practiced basic fabrication techniques. Midway through the lesson, the clamp on Mara's station malfunctioned, releasing suddenly, without warning, sending a heavy metal panel swinging loose directly toward the side of her head. I saw it happen, almost too fast to process, a blur of motion at the edge of my vision, but Mara's hand moved faster. She caught the panel by its edge before it struck her, stopping it dead in the air with a grip that did not so much as tremble, then set it down calmly on the workstation as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. The workshop instructor rushed over, apologizing profusely, checking to make sure she was unharmed. Mara assured him she was fine, her voice as calm and even as ever, and returned to her project without any further comment. But several students nearby had seen it too, and I noticed the way their expressions changed, the way a ripple of quiet unease moved through that corner of the room. A metal panel, heavy enough to genuinely hurt someone, moving fast enough to have caught most of us completely off guard, and Mara had caught it out of the air without so much as flinching, without a single wasted motion, as though her body had simply known what to do before her mind had time to catch up. I thought about Julian then, about his easy confidence, about the way he clearly believed her calm silence meant she had nothing behind it. I thought about the way he had smiled walking back to his seat after the assembly, certain that he had won something, certain that whatever line existed between mockery and consequence was one he could stand comfortably close to without ever crossing it. I did not know, not with certainty, what would happen if he finally did cross it. But watching Mara's hand close around that falling panel, faster than my eyes could properly follow, faster than seemed entirely fair for a person who spent most of her day sitting quietly and saying almost nothing, I understood, with a growing chill I could not shake, that whatever was coming would not look anything like the shouting match or dramatic confrontation that most of us at Solmere Academy had grown used to imagining when we thought about conflict. It would be quiet. It would be fast. And by the time anyone in the room understood what was happening, it would already be finished. By the third day, the whole school was talking about it, though not in the way I expected. I thought the assembly presentation would have made people uncomfortable enough to leave Mara alone, at least for a while. Instead, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Julian's confidence had grown, not shrunk, and with it came a small but loud group of followers who treated his behavior as something clever rather than cruel. Damon Fairweather started calling her the specimen whenever she walked past, always just loud enough to be heard, never quite loud enough to draw a teacher's attention. A girl named Odette Marchetti, who ran with Julian's circle, began leaving printed images near Mara's locker, pictures of dangerous animals with little captions comparing them to her, as if it were some kind of running joke the entire group found endlessly funny. I did not understand, then, why none of the teachers put a stop to it sooner. I understand it a little better now. Cruelty rarely announces itself clearly enough to be stopped in a single moment. It arrives in small pieces, spread out just far enough apart that anyone trying to explain it sounds like they are overreacting to something minor. A comment here, a picture there. A joke that could, if questioned, be explained away as harmless fun. By the time it becomes impossible to ignore, it has usually already gone too far. Mara said nothing about any of it. She continued to eat alone at the same table, take notes in the same neat handwriting, answer questions in class with the same short, precise responses. If the constant needling wore on her, she gave no visible sign. I found myself watching her more closely than before, not out of the same curiosity everyone else seemed to feel, but out of something closer to concern, though I could not have explained, even to myself, exactly what I was concerned about. It was during our free period on the third day that Priya finally said what I think both of us had been thinking since the workshop incident. "Someone should tell a teacher," she said, picking at the edge of her notebook. "Not about the jokes, about all of it. This isn't going to stop on its own." "Thorne already saw the assembly thing," I said. "He didn't do anything. He gave Julian a warning." "A warning isn't stopping anything," I said. "You saw him yesterday. He's not scared of a warning." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Then maybe somebody needs to actually stand up to him, in front of everyone, so people stop thinking it's funny." I did not say what I was actually thinking, which was that standing up to Julian Ashford in front of a crowd had already been tried, by teachers, by warnings, by the quiet disapproval of half the student body, and none of it had made the slightest difference. Julian did not respond to disapproval. He responded to attention, and so far, every attempt to shame him had only given him more of exactly what he wanted. I did not yet understand that the person capable of actually stopping him was sitting 3 tables away, eating lunch in complete silence, waiting for something the rest of us could not see coming. The turning point came at the end of the day, in the courtyard outside the main academic building, where students gathered before the transport shuttles arrived to take day students back to the residential ring. It was a wide, open space, framed by tall observation windows that looked out over the curve of the station and the blue planet turning slowly below it. Usually it was a calm place, full of quiet conversation and the low hum of transport engines warming up in the distance. That afternoon, it was anything but calm. I arrived just as Julian and several of his friends were gathering near the center of the courtyard, clearly waiting for something, or someone. It did not take long to understand who. Mara walked out of the academic building a few minutes later, her bag over one shoulder, her pace steady and unhurried as always, heading toward the bench near the far side of the courtyard where she usually waited alone for her shuttle. Julian moved to intercept her path before she reached it. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, stepping directly into her way, forcing her to either stop or walk around him. She stopped. "I thought maybe you'd want to stick around. Some of us were talking about doing a follow-up presentation, getting a little more hands-on this time. Maybe test some of those famous Deathworld reflexes everyone keeps talking about." A small crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by the sound of his voice, the particular energy that surrounds a confrontation before it has even properly started. I saw Priya near the edge of the crowd and pushed my way toward her, my stomach tightening with the same cold, uneasy feeling I had felt every time Julian focused his attention on Mara. "Please move," Mara said quietly. "Or what?" Julian said, grinning at his friends over his shoulder, clearly enjoying the attention the growing crowd was giving him. "I'm curious. What exactly happens if I don't move? What does a Deathworlder do when she doesn't get her way?" "I would rather not find out with you," Mara said, her voice still calm, still even, though I noticed something new in it this time, a faint edge of something that had not been there during the earlier confrontations. Not anger, something closer to a warning. Julian either did not notice the change or did not care. He reached out and took hold of her bag strap, not violently, but firmly, tugging it slightly, clearly testing how far he could push before she reacted in some way he could use against her. "Come on," he said. "Everyone's curious. Show us something. Prove you're not just all talk and sad little planet stories." The crowd had grown larger now, students pausing on their way to the shuttles, drawn by the same magnetic pull that draws people toward any conflict they sense is about to escalate. I saw Vice Principal Thorne's aide, a young Vantari staff member named Cassian Vale, standing near the edge of the courtyard, clearly aware something was happening, clearly hesitating over whether to intervene or wait to see if it resolved on its own. Mara reached up and removed Julian's hand from her bag strap with a single, precise motion, not rough, not sudden, simply firm enough to make her point without giving him anything he could point to as an overreaction. "I am asking you," she said, "to step back." For a moment, something in Julian's expression flickered, a small crack in his confidence, as though some part of him had registered, just for an instant, that the calm in her voice was not the same kind of calm he had assumed it was. But the crowd was watching, his friends were watching, and pride, I have come to understand, is a powerful thing when it has an audience to perform for. "Or what?" he said again, louder this time, stepping even closer, close enough that barely a hand's width separated them. "You'll snap? Is that it? Everyone's been saying you Deathworlders are like coiled springs, just waiting to go off. Let's see it. Go ahead. Snap." I do not think Julian actually believed anything would happen. I think, even in that moment, he genuinely believed himself to be completely safe, protected by the social rules of the school, by the presence of witnesses, by his own confidence that speed and privilege made him untouchable in every situation that mattered. He had spent his entire life being faster than the people around him, and speed, to him, was the only kind of danger worth respecting. He had no idea he was standing in front of someone whose entire species had been shaped, generation after painful generation, by a world that did not care about speed at all, if it was not paired with precision, with control, with the ability to end a threat the very first time it appeared, because a second chance was never guaranteed. Mara did not answer his question with words. She simply looked at him, and something in her expression settled into a stillness I had not seen from her before. Not the patient, waiting calm of the past 2 days, but something quieter and more final, like a decision that had already been made somewhere deep inside her long before this exact moment arrived. The crowd had gone almost completely silent now, sensing, even without understanding why, that something in the air had changed. Julian, misreading her silence as surrender, reached forward with sudden confidence and grabbed her shoulder, turning her slightly toward the gathered crowd, clearly intending to make a show of forcing her to face her audience, to complete whatever performance he had planned in his head. "See?" he said, laughing toward his friends. "Nothing. All talk. I do not know exactly how to describe what happened next, because it happened faster than my eyes were able to properly follow, faster than anything I had ever witnessed in my life." One moment Julian's hand was on her shoulder, his mouth still open mid-sentence, his friends still laughing along with him. The next moment, Mara's own hand had moved, closing around his wrist with a speed that did not look like speed at all, more like something simply arriving, fully formed, without any visible transition between stillness and motion. Julian's laugh cut off mid-syllable. His eyes went wide, not yet with fear, but with the confused surprise of someone whose body has understood a threat before his mind has caught up to it. He tried to pull his hand back, and could not. His fingers, I noticed distantly, had gone slightly pale where her grip held them. "I asked you," Mara said, her voice still perfectly calm, still carrying easily across the silent courtyard, "to step back." For one long, suspended moment, nobody in that courtyard moved. Julian's friends had stopped laughing. Cassian Vale, the staff aide near the edge of the crowd, had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on the scene with an expression I can only describe as growing alarm. Priya's hand had found my arm at some point without my noticing, her fingers gripping tightly enough that I could feel it even through my sleeve. Julian, to his credit, tried to recover, tried to force his usual confident smile back onto his face, even as something in his eyes had already begun to change. "Let go," he said, his voice not quite as steady as it had been a moment before. Mara released his wrist. For half a second, it looked as though the moment might end there, might resolve itself the way tense moments sometimes do, with both sides stepping back, breathing out, allowing the crowd to disperse, and the story to become nothing more than another piece of school gossip by the following morning. But Julian, humiliated in front of the largest audience of his life, could not let it end there. Pride, wounded pride especially, rarely knows when to stop on its own, and Julian Ashford had spent every day since Mara's arrival building toward exactly this moment, convinced that he held all the power in it. He stepped forward again, closer this time, his face flushed with the particular anger of someone who has just been embarrassed in front of everyone whose opinion he cares about, and reached for her a second time, faster now, less controlled, clearly meaning to prove, once and for all, in front of the entire courtyard, that whatever had just happened was some kind of fluke, some kind of lucky reflex that would not repeat itself. I remember Priya's grip tightening on my arm. I remember the sudden sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd. I remember Cassian Vale finally starting to move forward, his mouth opening to call out some kind of warning, though the words never quite made it out in time. And I remember, most clearly of all, the look on Mara's face in that final half-second before Julian's hand reached her again. It was not anger, it was not fear. It was the same calm, patient stillness she had carried with her since the very first day she walked into the dining hall, except now, finally, that stillness had reached the end of whatever quiet countdown had been running inside her since the moment his tray first knocked hers to the floor 3 days before. She did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. She simply moved, faster than any of us could properly see, faster than Julian's own famous Vantari reflexes could manage to react to, and by the time the crowd's collective mind had caught up with what was happening in front of them, it was already far too late for anyone to do anything but watch, in stunned, frozen silence, as the courtyard fell utterly, completely still. The sound was small. That is the part almost nobody expected, and the part that stayed with me longest afterward. Everyone in that courtyard had spent 3 days imagining Mara Voss as some kind of quiet storm building toward a loud, dramatic release. What actually happened was almost the opposite. It was quick. It was quiet. It was over before the crowd's collective breath had finished catching in their throats. Julian's hand never reached her a second time. Mara's own hand moved first, closing around the side of his neck with the same calm precision she had shown catching a falling metal panel 2 days earlier, the same unhurried, absolute control she brought to everything she did. There was a single sharp motion, controlled and exact, and then Julian was no longer standing. He folded to the ground without another sound. For a long moment, nobody in the courtyard moved at all. I remember the silence most of all, a silence so complete that I could hear the distant hum of a shuttle engine warming up somewhere beyond the courtyard windows, a sound that under any other circumstance would have gone entirely unnoticed. Mara stood over him for only a second longer, looking down at him with the same unreadable calm she had carried through every moment of the past 3 days, and then, without a word to anyone gathered around her, she stepped back, picked up her bag from where it had slipped off her shoulder, and sat down on the bench she had originally been walking toward, exactly as though she intended to wait for her shuttle as she did every single day. It was Cassian Vale who finally broke the silence, his voice cracking with a note of panic I had never heard from a staff member before. "Someone get medical," he said, already moving forward, already reaching for the communicator clipped to his uniform. "Now." Move, all of you, back, give him space." The crowd, which had been frozen in stunned silence only seconds before, suddened into chaos all at once. Students began talking over each other in raised, frightened voices. Some backed away quickly, as though whatever had just happened might somehow spread to them if they stood too close. A few, including Damon Fairweather, dropped to their knees beside Julian, calling his name, their earlier laughter completely gone, replaced by a fear that seemed to have arrived all at once, all together, the moment they understood what they had just watched. I stood frozen beside Priya, unable to fully process what my own eyes had just shown me. It had happened so fast, so cleanly, that some small, stubborn part of my mind kept trying to insist it could not have actually occurred the way I remembered it, that I must have blinked and missed some crucial detail that would make the whole thing make sense again. Medical staff arrived within minutes, moving with the practiced urgency of people trained for exactly this kind of emergency, though I do not think any of them had ever responded to a call quite like this one before. They worked over Julian quickly, their voices low and clipped, the kind of professional calm that only makes an emergency feel more serious rather than less. Vice Principal Thorne arrived shortly after, his broad frame pushing through the crowd of students with an authority that finally began restoring some order to the courtyard. He took one look at the scene, at Julian surrounded by medical staff, at the shaken crowd of students still standing frozen around the edges, and at Mara, sitting calmly on the bench, exactly where she had been heading before any of this had started, and his expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, alarm, and finally something that looked almost like exhausted recognition, as though some part of him had feared exactly this outcome from the very first day Julian had decided to make Mara's life difficult. "Everyone not directly involved," he said, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd, "return to the main hall immediately. Now." Most students obeyed quickly, relieved for an excuse to put distance between themselves and whatever they had just witnessed. I lingered near the edge of the courtyard with Priya, both of us too stunned to move quickly, watching as medical staff carefully lifted Julian onto a stabilizing stretcher and carried him toward the transport that would take him to the station's medical center. I want to be clear about something, because I know how these stories can sometimes be told in ways that make them sound simpler than they actually were. Nobody in that courtyard cheered. Nobody celebrated. Whatever satisfaction some students might have quietly felt at seeing Julian's arrogance finally meet a consequence, it was buried immediately beneath the much larger, much heavier weight of what had actually happened in front of us. A boy had been seriously hurt. However he had earned that outcome through his own choices, however many warnings he had ignored, however many chances he had been given to simply walk away, the sight of him being carried out on a stretcher left no room for celebration in anyone watching, including me. Vice Principal Thorne approached Mara's bench slowly, his expression carefully neutral, the expression of a man who has clearly decided he needs far more information before forming any judgment at all. "Miss Voss," he said quietly, "I need you to come with me." Mara stood without hesitation, her expression as calm as it had been throughout the entire encounter, and followed him without a single word of protest or explanation. I watched them walk together toward the administrative building, Mara's pace steady and unhurried even now, and found myself thinking that if I had not witnessed what happened only minutes before with my own eyes, I would never have guessed, looking at her now, that anything unusual had occurred at all. The rest of that afternoon passed in a strange, disjointed blur. Classes were officially canceled for the remainder of the day, though almost nobody I spoke with could focus on anything except what had happened in the courtyard. Rumors spread faster than any teacher could manage to contain them. Some students claimed Julian had thrown the first strike, and Mara had simply defended herself. Others claimed she had attacked him without any provocation at all, conveniently forgetting the 3 days of public humiliation that had led up to that moment. A few, more thoughtful students, myself and Priya included, tried to piece together an honest account of what we had actually seen. though even among us there was disagreement about certain details, about exactly how much warning Mara had given him, about exactly how much choice Julian had really had in the final moment. Professor Whitlock found Priya and me in the science hallway later that afternoon, his expression heavier and more serious than I had ever seen it. He asked us both, gently, if we would be willing to speak with the disciplinary committee about what we had witnessed. We agreed, though I remember feeling a strange knot of anxiety at the thought of it, worried that whatever we said might somehow tip the outcome one way or another for a girl I barely knew, but who I had somehow, over the course of 3 short days, come to feel a strange and unexpected loyalty toward. "How is he?" I asked, before Professor Whitlock could walk away. "Julian, is he going to be all right?" Professor Whitlock hesitated for a moment before answering, choosing his words with obvious care. "The medical team believes he will recover with proper treatment," he said finally. "It was a serious injury, but not, from what I understand, an injury without hope of healing. He will need time, possibly a great deal of it." I felt a strange mixture of relief and continued unease settle over me at those words. Relief that Julian would survive, that whatever Mara had done to him in that courtyard had not been intended, or perhaps even capable, of ending his life outright, despite how it had looked in that first frozen, silent moment. And unease, because even knowing he would recover, I could not shake the memory of how quickly, how completely, how effortlessly the entire encounter had unfolded, as though Mara had needed only the smallest fraction of her actual capability to bring it to an end. "Was it self-defense?" Priya asked quietly. "Legally, I mean. Will she be in trouble?" Professor Whitlock's expression grew even more thoughtful. "That," he said, "is precisely what the disciplinary committee and the station's legal officers will need to determine. There is video footage from the courtyard security systems. There are witnesses. The full sequence of events, including everything that happened over the past 3 days, will need to be examined carefully before anyone reaches a conclusion." He paused, glancing down the hallway in the direction of the administrative offices, where I assumed Mara was still being questioned. "I will say this much," he added, his voice quieter now, almost as though he were speaking more to himself than to us. "In all my years teaching comparative biology, I have given that same lesson about Deathworld adaptation dozens of times, to dozens of different classes. I have always tried to make students understand that appearances can be deeply, dangerously misleading. I do not think, until today, that I fully appreciated how true that lesson really was." He left us standing in the hallway after that, walking slowly toward the administrative building with the weary posture of a man who suspected the rest of his day, and possibly the rest of his week, would be consumed by the fallout of what had happened in the courtyard. Priya and I did not speak for a long moment after he left. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice small and uncertain in a way I had not heard from her before. "Do you think she meant to hurt him that badly?" she asked. "Or was that just what happens when someone from her world reacts?" I thought about the question carefully before answering, remembering the calm, measured way Mara had removed Julian's hand from her bag strap the first time, without harming him at all, clearly capable of ending the confrontation gently if she had chosen to. I remembered the warning in her voice, the clear, repeated request for him to step back, given not once but twice before anything happened. I remembered the metal panel she had caught out of the air 2 days earlier, stopping it instantly, precisely, without so much as denting it against her palm. "I think," I said slowly, working through the thought, as I spoke it aloud, "that she could have done a lot less than what happened, and I think she could have done a lot more, too, if she'd wanted to. I don't think what happened was an accident, and I don't think it was something she couldn't control. I think it was exactly as much as she decided it needed to be. Nothing more." Priya was quiet for a long time after that, staring down the empty hallway toward the administrative building, where somewhere behind those doors, a quiet, careful girl from a distant, dangerous world was answering questions about the single moment that had finally arrived after 3 long days of patience the rest of us had completely misunderstood as weakness. The disciplinary hearing took place 4 days later, in a small conference room on the administrative level of the station, though word of what would happen there had already spread through every corner of Solmere Academy long before it began. I was called to testify along with Priya, Professor Whitlock, Cassian Vale, and nearly a dozen other students and staff members who had witnessed some part of the events leading up to that afternoon in the courtyard. The committee included Vice Principal Thorne, 2 senior faculty members I did not recognize, and a station legal officer named Adrian Voss, whose calm, careful questions made it clear from the very first moment that he intended to examine every detail of what had happened rather than accept the easy, obvious version of events that some students had already begun repeating as fact. I remember sitting outside the conference room before my turn to testify, watching the door open and close as one witness after another was called in and eventually released. Mara sat several seats away from me during that long wait, her posture as calm and composed as ever, her hands folded in her lap in the same steady way I had grown so used to seeing over the past week. I wanted to say something to her, something reassuring, though I was not entirely sure what that would even sound like, or whether she needed reassurance from someone like me at all. It was Mara, in the end, who spoke first. "You do not need to worry," she said quietly, without turning to look at me directly. "Whatever happens in there, it will not change what already happened outside." I did not know exactly what to say to that, so I simply nodded, and we sat together in a silence that felt, strangely, less uncomfortable than I expected. When my turn finally came, I answered every question honestly, describing exactly what I had witnessed over the previous days, from the dining hall to the assembly to the final moments in the courtyard. I explained how Mara had asked Julian, twice, clearly and calmly, to step back before anything happened. I explained how she had released his wrist without harming him the first time he grabbed her, giving him every opportunity to walk away with nothing worse than a bruised sense of pride. I explained, as carefully as I could, the strange, unshakable feeling I had carried with me for days that something serious was building beneath her calm exterior, though I had never been able to properly warn anyone because I could not have explained, even to myself, exactly what I was afraid of. The legal officer listened carefully to every answer, occasionally asking follow-up questions, but never once pushing me toward any particular conclusion. It was, I realized later, exactly the kind of fair, careful process that Solmere Academy prided itself on offering to every student, regardless of species, regardless of background, though it was clear from the tension in the room that not everyone involved in the hearing entirely trusted that process to reach a fair conclusion. The security footage, when it was finally reviewed in full by the committee, told a story that matched almost exactly what I and the other witnesses had described. It showed 3 full days of escalating harassment, beginning with the tray incident in the dining hall and continuing through the assembly presentation and the repeated comments in the days that followed. It showed Julian approaching Mara in the courtyard, blocking her path, refusing to move despite her clear and repeated requests. It showed him grabbing her not once, but twice, the second time with enough force and speed that the footage, when slowed down and examined carefully, left very little room for interpretation about who had escalated the confrontation to a physical level first. And it showed Mara's response, when it finally came, lasting less than a single second from beginning to end. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours in total. When it finally concluded, Vice Principal Thorne called the full student body together once more, in the same assembly hall where Julian had delivered his humiliating presentation only days before, to formally announce the committee's findings. After careful review of all available evidence, including security footage and witness testimony, he said, standing at the same podium where Julian had once stood so confidently, the disciplinary committee has determined that Miss Voss acted in direct response to repeated, escalating provocation culminating in physical contact initiated without her consent. Her response, while serious in outcome, was found to be a proportional reaction under the legal and behavioral standards applicable to her documented physiological background. He paused, glancing around the silent hall before continuing. Mr. Ashford will face separate disciplinary action for his role in initiating and escalating this conflict over the course of several days, including harassment that this committee considers to be a serious violation of Solmere Academy's Code of Conduct. He is currently recovering under medical supervision and is expected to return to his studies once cleared to do so. A murmur passed through the hall at that, though it was quieter, more subdued than the reaction that had followed Julian's presentation days earlier. I glanced toward Damon Fairweather and Odette Marchetti, sitting together near the front, their expressions tight and unreadable, clearly processing the fact that the story they had helped spread over the past few days, the story of Julian as an innocent victim of some unpredictable Deathworld savage, was not the story the evidence actually supported. Vice Principal Thorne continued, his voice growing more serious. I want to address something else directly, because I believe it is important for every student in this hall to understand it clearly. Over the past several days, members of this student body have made comments, both public and private, about Miss Voss's homeworld and her species that this administration considers deeply inappropriate. That behavior contributed directly to the events that unfolded in the courtyard, and it will not be tolerated going forward, regardless of the species or background of the students involved. I looked toward Mara, seated in her usual place near the middle of the hall, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever, though I noticed, for the first time since her arrival, the faintest trace of something that might have been relief settling into the line of her shoulders. The weeks that followed brought changes to Solmere Academy that I do not think anyone, including Mara herself, fully anticipated. Julian returned to classes nearly a month later, quieter and considerably more careful than the confident, mocking student he had been before. He did not apologize to Mara directly, at least not that I ever witnessed, though he also never approached her again, never spoke to her again, and made a visible point of keeping his distance whenever their paths happened to cross in the hallways. Other students, meanwhile, began treating Mara with a strange, careful respect that had nothing to do with fear exactly, though I will admit there was certainly some fear woven into it. People stopped leaving jokes near her locker. People stopped comparing her to animals in whispered conversations. A few students, braver or perhaps simply more curious than the rest, began actually attempting genuine conversations with her, asking real questions about her homeworld, her childhood, the environment that had shaped her into the calm, controlled, quietly formidable person she had become. I was one of those students, eventually, though it took me several more weeks to work up the courage to approach her properly outside the context of shared classes. "Can I ask you something?" I said one afternoon, finding her at her usual table in the dining hall, the same table she had claimed on her very first day at Solmere. She looked up at me, studying me for a moment with the same careful, measuring attention she brought to everything, before nodding once. "Back in the courtyard," I said, sitting down across from her without quite asking permission, though she did not object. "Everyone keeps saying you couldn't have done anything different, that it's just how Deathworlders react. But I don't think that's true. I think you chose exactly how far to let it go. For the first time since I had met her, something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Mara's face, faint and brief, but genuine. "You're right," she said. "It is not instinct alone. Instinct gives you speed. Control decides what you do with it." "Then why did you let it go on for 3 days?" I asked. "The dining hall, the assembly, all of it. You could have stopped it much sooner." Mara considered the question carefully before answering, the same way she seemed to consider every question, weighing it fully before offering a response. "Where I grew up," she said, "you learn very quickly that reacting to every small threat wastes energy you might need later for something larger. A person who responds to every sound in the grass with full force does not survive very long. You learn patience. You learn to measure a threat honestly, rather than react to it emotionally. Julian's words were unpleasant, but they were not truly dangerous. I saw no reason to answer unpleasant words with anything except more patience. "And when he touched you?" I asked quietly. Her expression grew slightly more serious. "That," she said, "was different. Words are choices a person can walk back from. Physical contact, given without consent, especially escalating contact, is a different kind of threat entirely. On my world, hesitating to answer that kind of threat honestly is often the last mistake a person makes. I gave him every opportunity to stop. He chose, every time, to continue. I thought about Professor Whitlock's lesson from that very first day, about threat assessment becoming almost instinctive, faster than conscious thought, and understood, finally, that what I had watched unfold over those 3 days had never truly been a story about a bully finally meeting an opponent stronger than himself. It had been a story about patience, about the enormous, quiet discipline required to absorb 3 full days of public humiliation without responding, simply because the person absorbing it understood, far better than any of us watching, exactly where the real line was and exactly how much restraint it takes to wait for someone else to be the one who crosses it. Professor Whitlock brought up the incident once more in class, several weeks later, though he never mentioned either student by name. He used it, instead, as the opening example for a new lesson on interspecies conflict resolution, explaining to the class how easily entire diplomatic relationships between worlds had collapsed throughout galactic history, simply because one side had mistaken another's calm, patient restraint for weakness rather than what it actually represented, which was control refined over countless painful generations into something almost indistinguishable from stillness. It is perhaps the single most persistent mistake in interspecies relations, he told the class, pacing slowly at the front of the room as he always did, assuming that quiet behavior reflects a lack of capability rather than the presence of discipline. Human Deathworlders, in particular, have spent their entire history being underestimated by other civilizations precisely because they present as calm, ordinary, unremarkable people in nearly every social setting. It is only when that calm is finally tested that the truth becomes clear, and by then, it is usually far too late for the underestimating side to correct their mistake. I glanced toward Mara during that lesson, sitting in her usual seat near the window, taking the same neat, careful notes she always took, giving no outward sign that the lesson had anything to do with her personally, though everyone in that room understood exactly what Professor Whitlock was really describing. Solmere Academy continued on much as it had before, classes and assemblies and quiet courtyard conversations filling the days between one term and the next. But something had shifted permanently in how the students understood the world beyond their own experiences, a lesson none of us would have learned quite so completely from a textbook alone. Mara Voss never became loud, never became the center of attention, never changed the calm, quiet way she moved through her days. But she never again had to defend herself against anyone foolish enough to mistake that calm for an invitation, because everyone at Solmere Academy, students and staff alike, finally understood exactly what they were looking at whenever they saw her sitting quietly at her table, hands folded, eyes calm, waiting, always waiting, for a threat that never came again.